So I was super proud of my daughter Hazel yesterday because Annabelle was coming down and she was helping to host during our prayer time where everybody got together to pray for Easter. And 3 months before, a few months ago, there had been something like this that had happened at Faith Promise. We do the same thing. We have a day of prayer leading into that event. And Annabelle and I brought our oldest son, Marlo, and our oldest daughter, Hazel. Hazel's 10, and she was up front here a minute ago. And we went and sat one at a time. Annabelle took Hazel, and I took Marlo, and we sat in the prayer room, and we actually spent 20 minutes with them, switching back and forth and showing them how to pray for the different missionaries that were coming that weekend and for all the causes that we were hoping for God to be involved in. And when Hazel heard we were doing that again for Easter, she said, "Can I go?" And not only did she go and come with her mom, but she took 2 different time slots, 2 different 20-minute windows, and prayed for each of you, prayed for your loved ones, prayed for those that you're trying to figure out how to invite, prayed for that morning and that all the pieces would come together and God would be glorified in it. And so as a dad, it was a super proud moment. Not only that, but she also has been, and I don't pressure my children to do this, but she's also been saying, "I need more invites because I invited this friend, but I need to invite that friend to church too." And so she's handing out invites to a bunch of her classmates that she wants to make sure could be there for church. And admittedly, as 4th graders, a lot of them may not show up. They need mom and dad to drive them. But the compassion she has for the lost is something that I think is admirable. And frankly, a lot of grown-ups have not come in and spent 20 minutes solid praying. But I'm proud that my daughter, a 10-year-old, can do it. And next time when we come to Christmas and we do this again, that can be an encouragement to you guys to jump in and take that same step. So our passage today, we're going to be looking at the life of Abraham, and we're going to see that both Abram and God have a similar heart for the lost. And that's really going to come to the surface as we continue our study in Genesis. So if you have your Bibles, I want to encourage you to grab them and open them up to Genesis chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible, you can find one in the seat in front of you. It'll look just like mine, maybe a little less beat up. And if you're using that Bible, our passage today will be on page 15, so you can thumb right through to it there and find it. As we study through Genesis, we're seeing that God is laying out a lot of the fundamentals of life. Who are we? Why are we here? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How are we going to get there? Those sort of fundamental questions all of us have to wrestle with are being asked. And today, we're going to see a big look into the nature of God, who He is, and what kind of a heart He has, and also Abraham himself, who is the person God is using to found the nation of Israel and begin this process of bringing a Messiah out, Jesus Christ, who will die for the sins of all humankind. This is beginning 2,000 years before Jesus ever comes on the scene, and yet God prophetically is laying the groundwork for all of that. So, as you're thumbing your way there, we'll take a moment and come before the Lord in prayer. As usual, we're going to break our passage down into 4 or so sections. We'll read and discuss them. It's going to be pretty concise this morning because I want you to have more time to socialize afterwards and enjoy each other's company. But let's go ahead and take a moment right now and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you allow us to come before you in prayer, that we can open our hearts to you and not be seen as your enemy, but be seen as sons and daughters of you, because of what your Son, Jesus Christ, did on the cross. This Easter, we look back to that event. Help us as we study this to have hearts that are open to you and a desire to live out what you've shown us. We love you and we pray this in Jesus' name, Lord. Amen. All right, so Genesis chapter 18, we'll begin with verses 1 through 8. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under the tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs, of the finest flour, and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds that had been prepared and milk, and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. Okay, so Abram is there on a hot day in the Middle East, sitting under the edge of his tent. Shade is a high-value commodity when it's hot out in an era before air conditioning. And so he's sitting under the edge of his tent, keeping an eye on his property. And seemingly out of nowhere, 3 people appear. And Abram begins to immediately figure out these are not just normal people. His response to them helps to illustrate that. And I'll tell you in advance, excuse me, most scholars agree that likely who he is seeing is 2 different angels of God, and then also a third person who is likely to be the pre-incarnate Jesus. This is called a Christophany. So we're seeing Jesus before he's ever born. And John chapter 1 is really clear that Jesus did exist before he was born into the world. That in fact, all of the world not only existed after his time, but was created through him. And so Jesus is here appearing. We'll see some hints for that as we continue the passage. I'll point those out as we go. But nonetheless, notice Abram's response. He sees them and he runs out to meet them. And when he meets them, he lays flat down on the ground, bowing before them. Now, this is strange on a couple of levels. First of all, it is very unusual in the ancient world for an older man, let alone a wealthy older man. And many scholars have argued that Abram at this point in time is wealthier than any individual human being on earth is. So he's exceedingly wealthy. But he runs out to them. Now, running for somebody in his context is very unusual, because Abram's the kind of guy who could say, hey, I need somebody to do this. You, go, take care of it. He's got servants, literally thousands of servants who could do these things for him. So why is he running somewhere? Well, he sees that this is God and God's representatives here. And so he sprints out to them. And notice what he does when he comes. You would think that with Abram having the amount of stature that he has, the amount of power he has, that it would be other people bowing before him. But he doesn't entertain that thought for a moment. Whoever this is, he not only bows down to them, but he throws himself flat on the ground, prostrate before them. And once he's done this, he says, he comes and he asks them, hey, verse 3, if I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, don't pass your servant. Let me take care of you, in essence, is what follows. And that word he uses there, if I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, that word is actually the Hebrew word Adonai. And that is interesting because there's a couple different words that are used to say my Lord. Adonai is virtually always used in reference to God. It's not normally used in reference to a human being. And in fact, later on in this very passage, we'll see that Abraham's wife, Sarah, will call him my Lord in a respectful way, but it's going to be that other word. It's not going to be this word, Adonai. It'll be a different form of this same word meant to refer to human beings. So this is the first major, in terms of the content of the text, suggestion that this is actually God. And we'll see many of those more stack up as we go. Now, Abram says, let me get a little water, let me get a little bread, let me get a little morsel before you, and I'll take care of you. But you see what Abram does is way more than that. He goes to his wife, Sarah, and he says to her, effectively, go get 30 pounds of the best flour we have and start making bread like crazy. We want to make sure these guys do not run out of food. And then he goes out and he gets fresh milk from a cow, and he gets curds that most scholars would say that's probably equivalent to modern day butter. And so we've got bread, we've got butter, we've got milk, and then he goes out to the herd and finds the best looking calf there that's going to have the most tender meat, and he says, kill that one. That would be a common thing to do in a celebration in the ancient world. This is something you wouldn't do just every day of the week, but Abram has this calf butchered and gets the best meat off of it, grills it up, and he brings it to these angels. And notice when he brings it to them under this tree, and again, you might wonder, well, why are they under a tree? And again, that's the closest air conditioning you got. So, and if you've ever been out on a really hot day and had the choice of standing under a tree or not standing under a tree, it's a pretty substantial difference, right? If you can get that shade. And so it's not uncommon to have under a tree be a social area in the ancient Near East. So he's telling them to sit there. But notice when he sets this table with all of this premium food, really the best that he has to offer, fresh bread, butter, steak, all these things are laid out there. Does Abram sit at the table with them? No, he stands off to the side under the tree. And that's normally the posture of a servant. So Abraham, as the wealthiest guy on earth, presumably, is standing back there and he is bussing their table for them. Hey guys, did you need any more butter? I can get more butter. You just give me a second, I'll take care of it. So he is out there acting as a servant to them. Again, obviously, this is a situation where he thinks these are exceptional people And this is not just some average person. The ancient hospitality was a real sincere thing, but this would be above and beyond anything that you would expect. And nonetheless, he's got them set up with food. So let's see what happens in the dialogue that follows, picking back up at verse 9. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abram and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." So interesting back and forth that happens here. And it isn't being laughter is a common theme that we see sometimes at the miracle birth of children. We saw Abraham do something like that last week. Although for Abraham's part, it's received a little bit differently because he was laughing not because he disbelieved what was happening, but he was laughing because he believed it and he just thought it was so incredible to think about that he's going to have a kid when he's 100 and his wife is 90. Now for Sarah's part, it seems in context like after the angel makes this promise and adds one more little detail to their covenant, you're going to have a child. We've already said that. But guess what? It'll be within a year. You have less than 3 months to conceive, and then you're going to have a little one. And by the time I come back to you a year from now, you'll have that child and be holding it in your arms. That's where things are going. And so Sarah laughs at that, but she seems to laugh at the preposterousness of it, that that's just not possible. And the passage is clear in verse 11 that she was past the age of childbearing. So the Hebrew is really clear. She's already passed through menopause. She's going to be physiologically incapable of having a kid. And like we said, she's 90 at this point. Now, just to look into that subject a little bit, I did some research. I was curious, okay, well, how old is the oldest that a woman could have a child through natural childbirth if she wanted to? And interestingly, just in the last couple of years, a record was set on that front. And there was a woman out of Germany who at the age of 66 gave birth to a child. Now, I will mention that woman had several children in the last decade prior to it. And doctors do say that the more children you have, the more those hormones continue to flow, and the higher the likelihood that you can continue to have them. So that was a part of it. But I thought that was pretty astounding to be age 66. And I'll say, some of you here today might be thinking, well, what's the big difference between 66 and 90? Is that really that big a difference? That's less than 30 years difference. And I'll suggest to you, if you don't think there's a tremendous difference there, you should ask a 90-year-old if they feel any different than they did at 60. And I bet they'll have a pretty decisive answer for you on that. Maybe the most lucky of them won't, but most people from those 30-year margin will feel very different than they did. Let alone, would you be up to having a child at age 90? That would be a tough thing. So I'll say too, just as a aside, I also look to see what's the oldest age that any woman has had a child, period. And in the modern era, the oldest we've seen is 76. But that was using in vitro fertilization. So it was a donor egg. It's not a one-to-one comparison for what's happening here with Sarah in her situation. So Sarah is 90, and she's looking at all this, and understandably, she has some questions about it. How is somebody at my age going to have a kid, and how is that even going to work? Hebrews, when talking about this very event, actually refers back to Sarah and describes her as good as dead, which is not a super optimistic. Hopefully none of you have ever been described by your kids that way, like, oh, how old's your mom? As good as dead. But that's the description Hebrews uses for the state that Sarah is at this point. And yet God is going to extend her life, and God is going to bless her and carry her through this and bring the pieces together, which does raise the question, why does God even do this? Couldn't God have gotten her pregnant at 30 or 25 or something like that? I mean, of course God could have, but it seems like, it's not explicitly stated, but it seems like the purpose here is for God to show, hey, if you have any doubt about where Isaac came from, well, guess what? I said it was going to happen beforehand, and then a 90-year-old woman gave birth to him. That should remove all your doubt. That just doesn't happen every day. In fact, it doesn't happen at all unless God has come in and miraculously intervened. And so this all points to God is behind what's going to happen. And so when God chooses Isaac to bring the nation of Israel through him, when God chooses Isaac to ultimately bring about the Messiah through him, this initial miracle that God's doing should be a sign of he was behind this and he was at work in it. And this isn't all an accident. In fact, this was a feature of it to show that it wouldn't have happened had God not been in the middle of it. God intervened and blesses in this situation to take care of them. All right. Let's pick back up at verse 16. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." Now, here, Jesus remains behind with Abraham. They're talking. All the men are beginning to leave, and in a moment, the conversation will continue with just Jesus. But they're walking along. And interesting to note, geographically, we know the location of where these oaks of Mamre are, or at least the rough location, and it is on a hilly area that looks out over the Dead Sea. And on a clear day, you can see clear across the Dead Sea to the site right along the other shore, the opposing shore of where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located. So they're literally having this conversation, standing there looking a couple miles away and seeing that's the place that we're talking about. And God begins to have this internal dialogue. Hey, do I share this with Abraham or not? Which is interesting because I think God already knows what he's going to do, but he's trying to show Abraham why he's having this discussion. And so the first reason that he says that he's going to share this insight into what he's going to do, which really Abraham has nothing to do with. It's not necessarily Abraham's business, but God says, I'm going to share it with you, number one, because I have a covenant with you. And so we have this special relationship. I'm ultimately going to bring out the Messiah through you. When he says, I will bless all the world through you, or all the nations through you, that's a reference to Jesus. We've seen that before. And so because of this special relationship, I'm going to do this. But even beyond that, an additional part of this is, beyond that, you, Abraham, are supposed to train your children to obey me. And if they know what I did here today, they'll know I take sin pretty seriously. So he realizes Abraham will pass along this story to his children, just as Moses is doing on Abraham's behalf as he writes the book of Genesis. And the warning is here. When you're in the middle of your sin and you're really enjoying it and you're having fun with it and it seems impulsive and sweet and good, you've got to realize, number one, it's a poison to you. But number two, God takes your sin seriously. He sees it, and you might feel like, my sin's not that big a deal. Their sin's a big deal, but mine's not a big deal. We like to grade on a curve like that, but God doesn't. Your sin adds up, and eventually it's going to have to be dealt with. In fact, it so has to be dealt with that God will send his only son down to earth to die on a cross to take your penalty and mine upon himself, because he can't just look past that. He can't just sweep it under the rug. It's so serious that there has to be a payment made in blood. God himself is going to have to come down and get his feet muddy and his hands bloody to deal with your sin and mine. And this is all being foreshadowed through what's going to happen with Sodom and Gomorrah. And then he continues on by saying, the outcry against them has come up to me, which raises the question, where has the outcry come to God from? And two things I want to point out with that are likely answers to it. Number one, there are likely to be victims. When we see next week the kind of sins that are common in Sodom and Gomorrah, that any stranger that comes in their town, they immediately want to gang rape, for example. That kind of thing is the kind of thing that causes you to have victims, right? When people in a society broadly behave that way, there are people who are going to be shedding tears in some room if they survive the incident and saying, oh my gosh, God, please rescue me. Can't you do something about that? But yet God here is saying, I'm going to go down there, I'm going to look for myself. I've heard what's happened, but I'm going to go check it out myself. The second thing, though, I'll say in terms of the source of this, which we see hinted at with Cain and Abel, is actually the Bible's pretty clear that when sin begins to fill a land completely and people really hand themselves over to the deepest, darkest depravities they can find, the land itself cries out to God. In the story of Cain and Abel, we see God comes down to Cain and says, Cain, what have you done? Abel's blood cries out from the earth to me. So the earth itself is speaking to God, saying, something happened here that is so far off the mark, that is so broken, that it has to be addressed. Now, we're not sure which of those mechanisms, or if it's both, but God is hearing, and he's saying, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to validate it. I'm going to go look at it. But this is pretty serious stuff. And we've seen previously noted in Genesis that Sodom and Gomorrah, for decades now, have been the two most evil cities in the world. These are just places that are defined by the evil that's happening there. And it's not just one thing. It is probably every conceivable thing you can think of. Every way they can be evil, they've aspired to do it. And so God is going to go down. Now, I think it's interesting he's going to head down and look himself, because it speaks to the fact that God is not just going to take hearsay. He's not just going to take the words of one person. And if you're like me, you've probably prayed and been angry with somebody before and said, God, you really ought to straighten them out, but definitely don't do anything with me, right? Have you guys had that kind of prayer where we should fix them, but I don't want to deal with the hard part of fixing myself. Most of the time when we have a problem, there's two people to blame for it, and we're one of them. But God is saying here, I take this seriously enough, I'll look at it with my own eyes, and we'll see what it is. And I won't be tricked. I'll know exactly what's going on there. Not only will I have these testimonies that are coming to me of what wrongs have been done, but I will measure it and find out. Now let's read, starting in verse 22 through the end of the chapter, and see how Abram responds to this. The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abram remained standing before the Lord. Then Abram approached him and said, Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of the earth do right? The Lord said, If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. And Abraham spoke up again. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the numbers of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Once again he spoke to him. What if only 40 are found there? And he said, For the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there? He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. Abraham said, Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if 20 can be found there? He said, For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, May the Lord not be angry, but let me just once more speak. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left Abraham and returned home. So we see what in the ancient culture is often used as a negotiation tactic going on here, what seems to be. Abraham's going back and forth with God, and he starts with a clever way of addressing the subject with God. He's basically saying, God, I know you're good, and I know you're virtuous. In fact, you're going to be the judge of the whole earth. And so he's asking him, if there were 50 people that were decent people in Sodom and Gomorrah, would you spare it? Now, let me say, just for context sake, scholars estimate that probably somewhere in the area of 1.5 million people lived between the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the outlying areas. So this is a lot of people. 50 in proportion to 1.5 million is not a lot, actually. There's not a lot of decent people that would have to be alive. And God says to him, no, if there were 50, I would spare them. And I want to note with this too, there's a scholarly question that happens as to is Abram negotiating God down from his stance, Or is Abram trying to figure out what God's stance actually is? And I want to suggest to you, I think it's the latter. God doesn't say up front, even if there's one decent person there, I'm just going to burn it all to the ground. That wasn't his opening pitch. He said, I'm going to go bring my judgment to them because of these terrible, evil things they're doing all the time. But now Abram, I think, is trying to figure out, through negotiation, God, what is your actual stance here? What's too much collateral damage for you where it would cause a problem? And so he works his way down with great humility. He talks about himself, I'm just dust and ashes. I was made from dust, and I'll go back to being part of the dirt when I die. So I'm not the kind of person who can tell God how it is, and yet I know you're a righteous judge. So what if there were 45? Or what if there were 40? Or 30? Or 20? And clear down to 10, he asked the question. And naturally that leaves us wondering, what if there was even one? And we'll see next week, if there was one, he would sort that out. He would still have some provision that way. But Abram's trying to figure out who he is. Now, I'll note, historically we know from previous chapters, Abram's nephew Lot, who is his only family member who lives in this area with him, is living in Sodom. And so that does make these questions a little bit more pressing. He's got his family member he cares about that he literally went to war to rescue, and he knows he's living there. But also, Abram has seen a moral decline with Lot. Lot used to be with him and walk with Abraham and go on whatever adventure God called them to go on together, and then they had to part ways because they both got so rich their animals overwhelmed the grazing land they had around. And Lot chose to go towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And he didn't just choose to be in that county, but he decided he was going to build his tent right outside of the city. And then the next time we saw Lot, he was living in the city instead. And next week when we see him again, he's going to be in the gateway of the city in the evening, which is the kind of place that the elders of the community would tend to be. So he's not only moved into this evil city, but he actually appears to have maybe become a leader within it. And so the question is Abram asking this question only for the sake of Lot? And actually, I don't think that's likely. I do think it's intriguing, though, because Abram could have asked some different questions. Abram could have said to God, hey, God, look, I don't care who you kill, but if you could just get my nephew Lot and get him out of there, then murder the rest out of him if you want to. Just let your judgment pour on him, but rescue Lot. But notice he doesn't ask for that. And him not asking specifically for Lot's rescue seems to indicate that he cares about more than just Lot. But he could have asked another question. He could have said, hey, you say you'll rescue. If there are 50 good people there, is Lot one of those people? Would my cousin make that list? Or would my nephew make that list? Which makes you wonder, why didn't he ask that question? And part of me wonders if maybe Abraham is scared of the answer, right? Because he's seen what his loved one has done. I bet you've got some family members or some friends where, you wonder sometimes, are they really a Christian? Are they not? And maybe you, like me at times, are kind of scared. If God came down and really gave you the answer, would you want to know it? It's kind of nice to have some hope that maybe they're okay, even if they're not. So Abram avoids that question. Instead, he's talking about the whole of the people. So it's clear here, Abram's concern is not just for Lot. He could have asked some better questions if he was just worried about Lot. His concern is for good people who are living here generally. And so we can see two things here. We can see Abram having a great concern for people who are decent people to not fall into God's judgment and be unjustly punished. He understands that if you're going to live like hell, focused on the things of this world first and foremost, that God's wrath comes for that eventually. But for people who are being decent, he hopes there'll be some grace for them. And God echoes and says, yeah, absolutely there will. If those people are there, I'm not going to lambaste them for it. I'm going to take care of them. I'll watch out for people who have a heart for me and who at least have decent people, living in that way. And then I would spare them that wrath. I want to point out, too, as we talk through this, there is actually a legal concept that is built upon this notion, something called Blackstone's formula or Blackstone's ratio. And Blackstone was a English judge from a couple hundred years ago, and he wrote extensive literature on the justice system in the nation of England. And basically, Blackstone took this and posited from this idea that Abram and God are working out, that really for a criminal justice system to function properly, we need to be careful that we aren't so interested in punishing people who might have done the wrong thing that we sweep up a bunch of innocent people in that and hurt them too. And so the idea is sometimes, in the justice system, it's kind of gray. It's hard to tell. Did this person really do the wrong thing or did they not? And he suggested, it would be better that Blackstone suggested it'd be better if we let 10 people who are guilty go if one person was innocent, and we spared that innocent person from getting punished, especially when it came to heavier criminal ideas. And I'll say, interestingly, this passage and the intellectual development that happened from that is part of why in this country today, in criminal matters, if you were accused of murder or something like that, it's not your responsibility to prove that you didn't rob the bank. It's actually the state's responsibility to prove that you did. You have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the idea behind that is we might have some people who were guilty, and we kind of all know they were guilty, and they got off the hook, and that's unfortunate. But at least we're going to generally avoid people who are innocent, and maybe they were framed, or maybe they were just really unlucky, and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they really looked like they were in the middle of it. We'll shield them from having that same result. God's sense of justice has inspired in our country part of where our sense of justice comes from, and that's an interesting coincidence. Now, how do we put this into our lives? Well, it's intriguing to me that the founder of the covenant that will bring around the Messiah has so much compassion for the lost that one of the longest discussions he ever has with God is about that. Hey, God, let's make sure we don't leave anybody behind. Let's make sure if there's people who are decent in any way, we pull them out of this. And Jesus, 2,000 years later, when we see him entering Israel for the triumphal entry, prepared to lay down his life for people, that is exactly what he's focused on. Let's make sure we can redeem anyone who's redeemable. Let's make sure we can pull into God's kingdom anyone who has the heart to go there. And so at both ends of this equation, there is this action that's there, and God's character is there throughout that whole process. And I bring that up to say, I hope that we as a people have as much compassion for the lost as Abram and Jesus and God do. I've often prayed as a pastor, God, help me to love people the way that you love them. Help me to have your heart for them. We have a great opportunity this Easter, and you guys have heard me say it before. You get a great opportunity to use that invite and go change somebody's life by giving them a chance to come to church with you. They say 9 out of 10 people say if a close friend or family member invited them to church, they'd go. What if it was only half that? That would still be a tremendous difference that we were able to make in somebody's life. But even if you don't, even if you haven't handed out an invite, hopefully you will this week, but even beyond that, if you want to do something beyond that, today we've had an opportunity to fellowship among a lot of other, mostly believers. We've got some guests, and I hope that they are choosing to make some steps that way too, but we've had a chance to fellowship there. Next week is going to be what for most years would be our biggest Sunday of the year. You guys are all inviting people and bringing them along. And so I want to challenge you next week as a step of faith in all of this. Take a minute next week, just 5 minutes, and choose somebody you don't know and go up and talk to them and get to know them. And you might talk to that person and find out they've been going to this church since before you were born. You'll still have a good conversation with them. It'll still be okay. But maybe you're going to find somebody who's never been here before. And I'll say, when you're a guest coming into a church and you haven't been to church in a while, or maybe ever, one of the biggest questions you're asking is, would people like this accept me? Would they actually care about me if I was there? Am I going to be off in some corner and nobody's ever even going to come say hi? Or are they going to be interested in me? And so you can help sell people on the idea that this is a place where people care about them, because it is, and be a part of convincing them of that. All right, at this point, I'm going to ask some of our leaders to come forward to lead us in our communion and offering time. We have these candles that are up here, and during our closing song and after service, I want to invite you guys as a final step to come up here and light one of these evangelism candles. If you've got somebody you've been praying for that doesn't know Jesus, come up and say a quick prayer, light the candle, and we're going to leave those lit just as a way of our prayers raising to God like the smoke off the candle does, and we're going to trust God's going to honor that as an act of faith. Please join me for a moment of prayer. Lord, thank you that you have such a heart for lost people. I pray you'd help us today. It was somebody being nice enough and loving us enough to invite us, to love on us, that got us here. I pray that you'd help us to be that person for someone else. Lord, we don't have the ability to convince people of who you are. We can take simple steps of faith, but your Spirit is what convicts them. If there's anyone here today who hasn't taken that step of following you, I pray you'd open their heart to that and help them to see you. Help us to show them the love you want us to. Thank you for this Easter and for the great sacrifice your Son made. I pray this in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen.